Welcome to the Living Fullness podcast, where we talk all things life, virtue, and relationships. My name is Stina Constantine.
My name is Father Sean Burns. And each month we welcome a guest on the show who will share one aspect of their Christian life that they've found helps them to live life to the full.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Living Fullness. As you'll notice, I am without a co-host today, but I am not without our monthly guest. And in today's episode, I would love to introduce to you Daniel Principe. Daniel is Collective Shout's youth advocate and educator. He has a background in PR, marketing, media, and was a health professional and advisor for a non-for-profit. Daniel challenges toxic messages about masculinity in mainstream culture, which he critiques through a porn critical lens. He helps young men to see how these cultural forces fuel distorted ideas and attitudes about bodies, relationships, and sexuality. He works with young men to reimagine masculinity and embody a vision of manhood defined by virtue. He also hosts the Collective Shouts podcast, Reimagining Masculinity, and you'll regularly see him on TV and radio programs. So Daniel Principe, welcome to the Living Fullness podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Stina. It's great to be here.
I'm so excited for the conversation that we're about to have. Now tell us, where are you actually dialing in from today?
Sydney. Yeah, back in Sydney. Just came back from a couple of weeks in the US and then Perth later this week. So, yeah.
Yeah, right. There you go. Lots of traveling then.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a real privilege for the work to be able to travel around and see lots of people of goodwill all across Australia. And now I can say internationally too. So that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, very exciting. Well done to you as well.
Thank you.
I guess maybe to start with, Daniel, maybe tell us a little bit about, who is Daniel? What does the life of Daniel look like? Where is sort of a good place to start?
Sure. Well, the simplest way is my title is obviously youth advocate and educator with Collective Shout. So for those that don't know, Collective Shout is a campaigning movement against sexploitation, where we really try to advocate for the rights and well-being of women and girls against what we call a sexualized, a pornified culture. And so we do that through campaigning, through advocacy, and through education. I spend a lot of my time and efforts doing the education, engaging in schools, religious groups, chaplains, psychologists, health professionals, communities, having conversations about the harms of pornography and sexualization, as well as advocacy politically, campaigning, finding other like-minded not-for-profits who obviously care about these issues and people of goodwill anywhere. And then the other side that our team does is campaigning. So campaigning against corporations, advertisers, marketers, government, whoever who is using women and girls to sell products, sexualized, objectified portrayals of women and girls to sell products. And we've been super successful in that space of holding massive corporations from Alibaba to account, having ongoing campaigns against, say, Honeybird, as well as pulling down lots and lots of, sorry to say this, sellers of child abuse replica dolls. And so that's been something a couple of my colleagues have been absolutely unrelenting in their campaigning against on Instagram and Twitter, and getting these platforms to take down these dolls, these lifelike replica dolls of children.
Which is really quite horrific, like even hearing that being said out loud. Like, it's quite horrific to imagine that that's even where we're at.
It's pretty jarring. I don't always go out on it, but it's incredible when I do and see what even kind of ladsy guys that I've either gone to school with or have met along the way, they're absolutely disgusted by it, which I find refreshing, because sometimes in a sad way we become desensitized. And I know my colleagues stare into the abyss on this stuff. Is like, it's so easy to become desensitized because you're there. And then it's actually quite helpful when some ladsy bloke that you play footy with is, having a rant to you privately about how disgusting they found that to be. It's kind of helpful and a reminder that these things are desperately unpleasant. I mean, that's not even they're horrific, right? And it's just out of sight, out of mind for a lot of people. and yet it's becoming increasingly normalized. And so, my colleagues at Collective Shout do incredible work. If anybody's listening, please go check out. There are current campaigns running right now that you can actually support. Not everyone's going to be on the front lines, but you can support, you can share, you can retweet. So please, I encourage you to, join in on those campaigns. We need you.
100% in any way. Everybody has their own capacity that they can contribute. So for the guys that are on the front line, this is where the skills and the talents are being poured. And for those of us who are unable to, finding other ways to be able to provide that support is definitely something that, we can all consider in whatever ways is suitable for us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I guess maybe then tell us, Daniel, where does your passion point fit? What's your role and how have you ended up in this role then?
Sure. I think like many of us, we bring our own personal stories, our narratives, I guess what we've experienced in life and perhaps what those that we love around us have experienced as well. And so for me, it's been a long, steady journey towards wanting to do something about these issues. I think for me, I was exposed to pornography when I was 10, 11 years old. That started to shape how I saw men, women, girls, sex, intimacy, love, respect, violence, all of these very, very significant realities that we have to navigate as people. And that's part of my journey until I heard a message similar to now what I deliver in schools when I was about 20, 21, which helped me fully go, no, I don't want this to be a part of my life. I don't want to be a patron of the global sex industry, the porn industry. I don't want to be a patron of the trafficking and exploitation that sustains this industry. And so that was my journey. In parallel to that, I know that a lot of people that I have loved and cared about, family, friends, previous relationships, people have experienced sexual assault, sexual abuse, and that was just something that was never too far away. Predominantly, I've heard that from women, but I've also heard it from grown men as well, and they've been some of the hardest conversations I've sat through in life is listening to people express what has happened to them and how they've survived and forged a life forward from that. And so, that has always stuck with me, and I feel kind of a duty to honor them and their stories in the best way I can, as led by them in these issues, to try and push back on the normalization of the sexualization of children. And so that's a part of it. And then I think, in terms of right now, the estimate's 42 million people in sexual slavery around the world. I mean, this is one of the biggest injustices of our world that just frankly doesn't get enough attention, certainly not in Australia. Certainly not in Australia. I've just come back from 2 weeks in the US and I was blown away by how much attention. I mean, it's obviously a bigger scale. I know I'm in those circles, but it was extraordinary that I wasn't the only one talking about these issues everywhere I went. And there seemed to be more of an awareness of how significant this issue is. And so I think for me, it's just something that demands so much of a response from us as a society. And in parallel to that, trying to use what I've studied, my undergrad's health professional, my postgrad's media and PR. I worked as an advisor in politics and in health. I'm very fascinated with how media shapes attitudes and therefore behavior. I studied propaganda as part of my postgraduate, and I guess I look at pornography and sexualized media as the most powerful form of propaganda we've ever served up to civilization, and we're now seeing the significant harms and social consequences of that.
Something you said there, which I think is really interesting, even just the comparison between here and the States as well. Do you find, and look, maybe I'm just not in the same circles as you, so perhaps there's a difference there too, but do you find that in Australia, even the dialogue around this space, there isn't as much of a challenge or a noise for the challenge as there is in the States? Like it's not even a point of contention in Australia because there's still so much overexposure in the media that we're not even seeing it as a problem yet.
I agree with that. I think we've steadily become desensitized to the sexualization of children. Pleasingly, there's been some public and cultural pushback of late that we've seen and people getting quite demonstrative about that, but still not enough. And I think just the normalization of what is now labeled sex work as well makes people kind of muddy the waters in terms of the harms and how much that actually impacts people and the harms of that industry. And so, there seems to be a lack of a recognition of that in Australia. And especially just as a statistic, we are the third highest consumers of child abuse material coming out of Southeast Asia.
Oh, man. That is shocking.
It really is.
Alarming
So
statistics.
that's what our Australian Federal Police and other agencies focus a lot on, is how much of that is actually going on here. Live streamed abuse. Obviously, our colleagues and partners at International Justice Mission, they've been campaigning against this as well. And so, this is a horrific injustice. It's a harm that needs serious justice to be done here in Australia. But it's not just the punishment, it's how have we created such a demand for that? Why is there a rising desire for the abuse of children here in Australia?
I guess one of the things that I was hoping to be able to do in this interview with you, Daniel, is to be able to help us have a dialogue around masculinity. And I guess being that is something that you actually do directly, you actually do speak to young men directly and about what masculinity could look like. Mm-hmm. Maybe if we could open up, what do you think are some of the challenges that are facing young men today? And maybe we can start to pull apart, is there such a thing as authentic masculinity, and what even is that?
Sure, yeah. In terms of the challenges for young men, I think we've always faced similar things. It's just within a social media sexualized age, I think they are just amplified. So boys have always had insecurities. Boys have always tried to work out how to become a man. That invitation's always been open. But for most of human history, there's been rites of passages. Most cultures throughout the world have had pretty similar themes within their rites of passage, where a boy would enter into manhood by achieving, doing certain things, accomplishing certain things, and proving not only to his community, but also to himself that he was in fact a man, and displaying certain traits that was recognized. Some of that is great. Some of it I would disagree with now in hindsight as to how we could expand that to have a more fulsome view of masculinity around, say, virtues, which is where I would anchor masculinity. But that's always existed. There's always been pressures and limitations around that. But there has always been some sort of passage. Now, for boys, all there is sex, drinking, gambling, risk-taking behavior, because there is no adventure, there is no journey for them to go on. There is no war for them to fight or a wild animal for them to slay. And so where do you channel that? And so that is the biggest question I think we're asking ourselves now as a society that is very much neutralized a lot of those outlets, and for good reason too. I'm not saying we need to go back to sending 13, 14-year-old boys into the wild to hunt an animal, but where can we channel their energy? Where can we channel their desires for self-mastery and to accomplish things in the world? And irrespective of what their particular desires or interests are, whether that was musical, whether that was literature, whether that was athletic or academic, what would it look like to harness that and help a young boy challenge himself and overcome things within himself? And so, devoid of all of that, you now have a landscape where pornography exposure is increasingly more normalized at higher and higher rates. And then you also have the rise of these extraordinarily toxic influences that are filling that gap, where boys perhaps are looking to, and I'm not going to mention them, looking to these voices to fill in the gap of what it is to be a man. And all of them center on dominance, on controlling women, on having lots of sexual partners. It reinforces a lot of the really ugly stereotypes, and for me is devoid of virtue. And so boys have got all of this noise now with the rise of voices saying that boys need to be more gentle, more kind, more respectful, more decent, and rightly so. And some of those voices do a great job of that. Some of them do a really poor job of that. And so boys are sitting here in this dynamic of, well, I've got these voices telling me to be dominating, to be controlling, to be aggressive, to be all these things. And then other voices saying, well, can you be kind? Can you be compassionate? And it's like they're sitting here in the middle of all of this trying to work out what's what, like which way to go. And there's more competing ideas than that. And so I think I feel for young boys. I had a Nokia 3310 when I was going through high school. These boys have got a smartphone and everything that entails. And so when people say things to me like boys aren't acting respectfully, boys aren't acting with decency, well, first of all, it's not all boys. And secondly, I'm not surprised. I don't know why anyone would be shocked when, for the average boy, they're being exposed to hardcore violent pornography. They're navigating toxic online influences. Then there's the social shaming where they're bullying one another to be kind of the most degrading, most obscene version of themselves. I call it like performative toxicity because it's not truly who they are. It's a show. And so you put that melting pot together. I'm shocked if I see a decent young man who can hold true to his values and not conform to that. Like, that's the miracle for me, because I see how hard it is, and these boys tell me how hard it is. The good boys are shamed. They're called all sorts of slurs, and they're shamed for showing basic decency. Now, I'm not saying that we should celebrate these boys and build icons, dedicated to them. But if we don't actually rally around those boys and incentivize their kind of model of masculinity that is both courageous and kind, that is both empathetic, and caring, like, if we can't carry all of that, that shows us strength in their display of values, we're going to lose a generation of boys.
Yeah, 100%. Gosh, there was so much in there, Daniel. So much. On the one hand, I'm hearing you say that this is conversations that you have every day with these young men when you encounter them. So this is very much in the here and now, but also that pressure that you're talking about too. There's an expectation that's being built socially with it, perhaps within their school environments. There's there's friendship circles, which is only being further exacerbated through the media. Yep. So it's all like subculture.
That's right.
That's happening here. You're absolutely right. Why are we so surprised to see the worst coming out?
That's right. And then kind of berating that just further is reinforcing this idea that the world's against boys. Now, I think there are serious things that need to be challenged, critiqued, to be acknowledged, for there to be accountability. 100%. That's exactly part of what Collective Shout, what we do in schools, right? And we try and bring this, but more from an educational and awareness piece. And saying, hey, this is not ideal for you, for your relationships. You could be so much more than this. So, but there has to be that. But then there also needs to be a sense of, well, what are we helping them aspire to? And for a lot of boys, they feel disenfranchised. And whether that is a fair or unfair, or whether that's true or not, that is how they feel. It's why I have to spend a good 15 minutes at every school where I'm engaged with boys to dispel those myths that I'm there to condemn them for the sake of being boys, that I don't care about them. I have to spend so much time before I can even get started in my presentation to hopefully assure them that I am there because I care for them, that I'm recognizing their challenges, and that I want good for them. And that I'm going to champion them more loudly than anyone to be that. So it's hard because there is this environment. And again, perceived or not, that's the cards that I'm being dealt with in every school. So whether we think they shouldn't or shouldn't feel that way, well, it's besides the point. A lot of them do feel disenfranchised, and they are almost testing the adults in the room to see, like, if I play up, will you still stick around? Will you actually recoil? Will you just, play into this narrative that we're all bad young men? And so I try not to take the bait if that ever happens. Pleasingly, it doesn't. And pleasingly for your listeners, and people need to hear this, is like I get to see the very best of young men. Because when I enter into there and I set the stage, I say to them, boys, I'm going to champion you guys today. I'm going to give you every opportunity to be your best selves. I'm going to welcome you, bringing your courage, bringing your empathy, bringing your insights, your care for one another, your care for women and girls. Like, bring that to the table. I don't care what you've done up until this moment. This is a clean slate. Bring your best selves. And I routinely get to see boys caring for one another, checking in on one another, putting a shoulder on, hand on another boy's shoulder if they're upset or emotional because they themselves have been bullied, because some of these messages that we're unpacking have really harmed them, like they have me and all men, about not being man enough, being tough enough. Boys don't cry. Don't be a girl. Don't be a wuss, and far worse things that I won't say on your podcast.
Sure.
And so there needs to be a space where boys can feel this stuff and they can go, hang on a minute, that's actually not serving me, and it's not serving us as young men if we want to be these virtuous young men who have integrity. And so we have to kind of create that. I feel like we're going to bulldoze all the social cultural baggage that's already in the room and then try and start and build upwards from there.
Yeah. When you walk into a group like that, who are being shamed by society, who are being put down at every turn, who are being told everything about them is unwanted and undesired, no wonder the defenses are up. Like, we can't expect anything else. That should be the natural response at a form when you're being attacked, is to have your defenses up.
And it's also what makes them ripe and easy prey for any kind of one of these toxic voices to like say to them, well, I'm going to help you. I'm going to guide you. You know, I'm going to help you stick a defiant finger up against the world who's not for you. I'm going to champion you, help you win in these scenarios. Like, that's a very tempting situation if you're not feeling like things are going your way. And so, we have huge work as a society to help, engage our young boys to help them be their best selves and hopefully give them a vision of masculinity, like I said, around virtue. And that for me is why I reject a lot of these toxic influences, purely based on, I reckon, self-control, based on their limited / devoid visions of love, you know. And one of the sad things that I have found is in my workshops with the boys is love is one of the last things that comes out after much cajoling in terms of the attributes that a good man or a healthy man would embody.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So we put lots of great words up on the board. So caring, serving, looks after children, helps out around the home. Like we'll really, you know, courageous, stands up for women and girls, stands up for his men. We'll put so much up, and then I'll sit there, and I reckon this has happened dozens of times, and the word love never comes out. And I'm always fascinated if they've thought that, but then just been too afraid to say it because, you know, love is such a like, oh, a man wouldn't use that word. If there's, again, baggage around that. But I find that really fascinating. And I think for me, when we can point to virtues as the measure of what is a good man and a good human, frankly, then we can then start to weigh, well, how do these other voices, do they actually line up to that? Some of these voices boast about exploiting other men, bankrupting other men for their programs. I mean, is that what a good man does? Is that really really being a good brother and friend and helping and championing other men? And so trying to help boys navigate through these voices and try and work out, well, what does it look like for them to show up as their best and healthiest selves is a real task.
So I guess let's go there then. What does the reimagining in terms of virtue actually look like? Like what does that look like in terms of the workshop, but also what does that look like for participants who aren't in the workshop and might be listening to this podcast, or someone who might get shared this podcast? You know, what does that even look like?
It conjures up all sorts of thoughts. So some people think for me think that it's me trying to dissolve everything old, and it's certainly not the case. And it's also not saying that everything old is great. It's actually to say that there are some timeless virtues that we should hold on to. And what does it look like to reimagine, rethink, or reapply them in this current cultural moment? Like that's what it is.
Right.
It's to say that, you know, if you start using words like temperance and prudence right now, I'm not sure if that's going to resonate with the average person on the street. But, you know, what does it look like to say self-control or self-mastery or courage? You know, what does it look like to make smart decisions? You know, and so it's like, how do we translate it for this current culture? So it's not to reject it. It's very much to bring it into this moment, but to say, well, what resonates? How do we translate that in a way that is accessible? You know, what does faith, hope, and love look like for all people, irrespective of, you know, of whatever their spiritual or faith beliefs may be? And what does love look like? Not the Hollywood version of love, you know, but actual true love. What does that mean? How can we talk about that? And one of the things that I use is it's probably Mumford and Sons paraphrasing Thomas Aquinas, but in Mumford and Sons' song Delta, which is one of my favorite songs of all time, Marcus asks the question, does your love prefer the other, or does your love just make you feel good? Now, I quoted that to a school here in New South Wales, and the kids had never heard of Mumford and Sons, which made me feel extraordinarily old. But I was like, that's the question we got to ask. Like, does your love prefer the other? Is it interested in seeking another person's good, in them flourishing, in them thriving, or is it all just about you? And is it selfish, in which case it's not really love? And so I think there's a huge task as well on each one of those virtues to even say, well, what do we mean by this? And also, what don't we mean by this? Love isn't some fluffy thing. And courage isn't just about, are you courageous on a sporting field? Or, we're about to celebrate Anzac Day, which is a wonderful thing. And we should acknowledge the courage of people who have fought so much for our freedoms and the incredible, quality of life that we have now. However, it's not limited to that. And an area that I see men really struggling to be courageous is in their convictions. And so for me, again, like courage, great. What does that mean? How can we expand on that to not just be such a limited vision of that? And so, I see a lot of men who really do struggle to be courageous when it comes to, emotional maturity and actually, in their both romantic relationships and in their friendships, showing up fully, wholeheartedly. And I think, that's a huge area. Again, that what does it mean to reimagine that, to think about that and its implications in all of our relationships?
I mean, if I was to try and summarize some of what you've said there in terms of virtue, you're really talking about the core of virtue being love. Like all the virtues, the core of it is love, and that's unchanging throughout all of history. True virtue should be anchored in love. But what you're also talking about is how do those virtues manifest themselves in our modern day,
Absolutely.
in today's day, which should always be the question, regardless of what time it is, whether the past, the future that is to come. That should always be the question. How do we actually live out these virtues within this context and in my life?
That's right.
Not, in somebody else's, but in the time and space that I have and in the influence that I have, in the sphere that I'm put in. That should always be the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, and I think something that I touched on recently in another interview was I think the conversation needs to also feature like meekness. I think when I think about masculinity.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of push out there for men to be as strong as possible, to build their wealth, to build their resources, to build their status, their position in society. Great if you're able to do that ethically, not at the expense and harm of others. If you're able to do that through service, through sacrifice, through actually bringing people along with you for the journey, which is what I think a leader does. It's not just about a zero-sum game of you succeeding, but even say if you do succeed and you do it well and you do it ethically and you do it with considering others, what do you do with that status? What do you do with that power? What do you do with that wealth? And in a sense, for me, that's where meekness has to feature. We have to ask ourselves, meekness isn't being weak. It's actually recognizing the privileges, the strengths, the resources you have and laying it down to serve others, to seek the good of other people, to create space for other people. And so I think that's where, again, the toxic influences are really disconnected from virtue, because I'm like, I tell boys, like, go and succeed in your music, in your art, in your athletics, in your academic pursuits. Be the best son, brother, friend you can be. Go and start a business. Go and volunteer. Start a not-for-profit. Like, gosh, there are so many gifts and talents the world is desperate for you to give expression to. Please, like, switch off the games, get off pornography, switch off social media and show up in the world with all your talents and gifts, please. But then if you do succeed, what are you going to do with that? How are you going to do that for the benefit of others? And I think that's where, the conversation has to come back to service. It has to come back for care and sacrifice. And then again, that's a message that's missing from a lot of these toxic influences out there. Is what does sacrifice look like? And again, we talk about this when it comes to military sacrifice, or someone sacrificed for the team. Maybe they've taken on a defensive role in an AFL side, so they're not getting heaps of statistics and accolades, but they're doing it for the sake of the team, which is great. But then what does it look like to sacrifice for your relationships or the world around you or a community?
And do you find when you're talking to the men then that they intuitively know the answer, or are you finding that you're having to sort of brainstorm with them for them to be able to see it with clarity? Or is there a bit of a mix in between?
A mix, but I would say that whenever I open up these questions, I'm always overwhelmed with the answers. State schools, private schools, co-ed schools, single sex, like they're there. They get it.
Yeah.
They can tell me all the things that are unhealthy stereotypes. They can tell me all the healthy stereotypes or what a healthy relationship would look like. Or when I ask them to critically assess the sexualized media representations that I present to them, which aren't graphic because these are from mainstream shopping centers, these are from mainstream advertisements, they can tell me these are women depicted as slaves, as animals, as sex objects, as pieces of meat, as this. Like they can do that analysis. I'm talking 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old boys without question everywhere I go, irrespective of the school. So they get it intellectually, but we all know that you can understand something intellectually, but that doesn't mean that translates to you embracing and embodying that and living it out. And especially if the cultural and social context that you have to make your decisions and your ethics in makes it even harder for you to choose the right thing, then I genuinely think that like these young men need more character, more courage, more virtue because of these challenges, because of how hard we've made it to just be basically decent.
A decent human being, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I guess then in trying to sort of wrap around this conversation that we're having, where do you see the role of, you know, people like community? Where do you see the role of people who are surrounding men, just people in general? You know, because I'm sort of picturing parents who might be listening to this podcast or watching this podcast and feeling overwhelmed, like that's my son that they're talking about. What do I do in this space? Or, you know, a sister who might be thinking, I think that's my little brother. Like, I think that's what's going on here. Or a friend who's going, yeah, you know what? I know several friends who are stuck in this pornographic culture, and I know they're influenced by it because they've told me, or I've seen things, you know. What do we do in this space? How can men support each other, but also how do parents and women support men in this space too?
It's a great question. You may need to prompt me if I forget some of those elements to it. So I feel for parents. I just want to start with the fact that I'm not a parent, so I'm not going to come here and parent-splain and make out like I have all the answers on all of this. Again, it's hard for young people. It's hard for parents. Parenting in this age of social media, competing voices, we don't have the same social and community fabric that we once did. Like we say it takes a village to raise a child, but like where's the village? We live very fragmented, individualized, consumer-based lives. And so I feel for parents. I feel for single mums who are trying to raise their boys. I was raised by a single mum. You know, like how do they find the support and the touch points? And I've read different research that boys need like 32 different male touch points to get them through their adolescence, you know, of positive examples. And that doesn't mean day in, day out, but, you know, I'll have to find the research on it. But irrespective, we acknowledge that it's not just even if you've got a great dad, and I know lots of great dads doing their absolute utmost to raise their boys, even if that scenario, because people say, oh, it's fatherlessness. Well, yeah, that's an element, but it's beyond just even good dads. The culture is so difficult. They need good older brothers, good uncles, good fathers, good footy coaches, good drama coaches, good debating coaches, good teachers. You know, like we need these touch points. And then what do you do about the social media and popular culture representations, you know, because it's not just what's happening in their immediate world, it's what they're consuming through music, through TV, through pornography. And that's a huge thing to compete against. And so parents, I know lots of wonderful, intentional parents who are saying we're doing our utmost to raise our kids well, but finding it increasingly difficult because the village has failed and culture has failed. You know, there's not enough positive examples, and it's not even just an absence of the positive. It's actually the fact that they're being fueled and encouraged to do things that are detrimental to their own integrity, but to the well-being of others as well. And so what can we do? Well, we have to model it if we're not doing that as an alternative. And that doesn't mean getting it perfect. It actually means acknowledging, especially as men, I haven't lived virtuously. I haven't done the right thing. I haven't stood up for my mates when I should have. Do you know what? I've treated women poorly. I've been disrespectful, or I've watched other men disrespect women and I haven't stood up. And like, I need to own that, you know, like I've turned a blind eye to some stuff when I could have said something. And so I think, you know, like there's a start with humility, start with acknowledging that we've all contributed to what I call porn culture and this, you know, unhealthy stereotypes that are now being reinforced. Like, we've all participated in it. We've all either allowed it or not challenged it, and it's impacted us. And I think a good process for everyone is to kind of unpack, well, how has it impacted me? Can we make that conscience? Can we be aware of, like, how has porn culture, how has this sexualized culture impacted us? How has it impacted us personally and relationally? Because kids want authenticity, and it may not look like mum and dad talking to their kids directly about this stuff, but I would encourage it. And certainly to create a space where all questions are okay, because if your kids are talking to you, like, that's a great outcome. You know, that's an incredible thing. And not to shame them, not to tell them that they're wrong if they are watching toxic influences or pornography. They're being groomed by algorithms, billion-dollar industries that know your kids better than they know themselves, you know, and they haven't developed the capacity to think through this just yet. So if they're coming to you,
and they have an agenda.
Totally welcome that. Thank them for it. Keep the conversations going. It's not about trying to challenge or correct everything in one conversation. It's just having that constant dialogue. So I would encourage that as well, to just not think that this is a one-off conversation. It's an ongoing one, and it doesn't need to be perfect the first time. And I think always start with humility, always start with an acknowledgement of, like, well, these were my poor male influences. These were the poor role models that I had. These are how they impacted me. These are the elements of a healthy manhood, or just being a healthy human, that I needed to grow in. Like, there's a conversation to have. And so, yeah, that's what I try to do with the boys. I don't come in talking to them like I'm some angel in a cloud immune to all of this. I say to them, like, I'm still navigating porn culture. I'm still having to unlearn things that I've learned through porn exposure, through what the world around me is teaching me, and try and fight for healthy relationships with myself, with my same-sex peers, and with women and girls in the world. And so, yeah, I think that's a huge part of it. In terms of what women and girls can do, like all of us, like, raise our standards. I think, and I feel for girls, because so many women my age are telling me, you know, they feel they have to compromise. And the thing is like, if they don't, and if they collectively don't, and therefore men have to actually up their game, be more virtuous to win the affections of a woman or her friendship or whatever it may be, that's a benefit to everybody. So the more that we all raise our standards on what we're happy to accept in terms of friendship, and certainly a romantic relationship, that's huge. And so that's what I champion for the young girls, and I champion it for the young boys, to be that, to want healthy relationships. And so we all owe that to one another, to get healthy ourselves, and then to aspire to healthy relationships. And so I think that's the main thing that women and girls can do. It's not up to women and girls to save boys. I think it's just to encourage them to aspire to healthier role models, and for women and girls to just be healthy themselves and say, I'm not going to tolerate with certain things, and to walk away from it.
Yeah, 100%. As you were speaking, I was like, give that man a microphone and blast that, because that is so on point. So on point. It's not our space as women to be able to jump in and go, let me fix it. Let me, you know, that's not our space. But we do have something to be able to offer. And that raising of standards is exactly it. One person is just one drop. Yes, okay, how much influence can that make? But one drop starts the ripple.
And help your girlfriends, help your friends to do that. Don't throw them under the bus, you know, like there's that sort of stuff. Like if a girl's like, nah, I'm not going to keep dating this guy, he's been disrespectful, he's not respecting my boundaries, then, you know, support her in that. You know? For men, I think, you know, there's huge part to play in terms of how they model, how they treat women, helping boys to respect women and girls, to listen to them, to integrate their experiences into their understanding of our shared humanity. And so I try to get boys to listen to the experiences of women. I don't force that. I just invite them. It's an invitation to listen to the stories of women, to humanize them.
Yeah. I think what you're saying there is so key to that invitation, because that's all we can ever do. We can't actually force someone to respect another person. We can only ever invite them to choose to respect.
That's right.
So I think that's such powerful words that you've used there. Really, really powerful. Thank you so much for being willing to have this conversation with me, Daniel. I'm so appreciative.
Oh, I love it.
It's been awesome.
Oh, it's great. I enjoy this a lot, and yeah, still learning, still thinking about it. You know, even now I'm sitting here reflecting on how to continue to improve how I engage with boys and what could be beneficial and integrate what they tell me. So yeah, it's an ongoing process, always learning, always needing to be shown that there's other things that I haven't yet seen, stories I haven't yet heard, perspectives I don't yet know.
I'm so conscious too that the conversation that we've had is just sort of just starting to peel back. We've not even gone anywhere deeper. So maybe you can share with our community where people can go to find more of your work and Collective Shout's work.
Great. So yeah, go to collectiveshout.org. You can see the campaigns. You can invite us to schools or communities or your business or organization to come and give a talk similar to this and talk about what we can do to act personally or act collectively to address these issues. If you wanted to kind of learn more about these kinds of conversations, I have a podcast series on YouTube called Reimagining Masculinity, where I interview kind of experts across the globe on these topics, where we really delve in deeper. And then I would commend the blogs and articles that my colleagues at Collective Shout have written as well, to really immerse ourselves in these justice issues and the research behind the harms and what we need to do as a society to rectify them.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Again, Daniel, thank you so much for being on the podcast here with us today and for being able to share your gifts, talents, and knowledge and learnt experiences with us as well. We're really grateful for it. And thank you guys for joining us this week on Living Fullness, whether you've been listening in at home or you've been watching on YouTube. We're so grateful that you tune in every week and every month for our guest interviews. Make sure, if you haven't already, jump over to Patreon and become a Patreon member, because we're about to continue a conversation with Daniel today. Now, I've got a question around desensitization and around resilience for Daniel as well. So jump over to that. But as always, we will catch you again next week. And until then, know about love and prayers.
If you enjoyed having our guest on the show as much as we did, please consider jumping over to Patreon and supporting the podcast.
Your donation will help cover the costs of this podcast and give you access to some behind-the-scenes content with our guests, to give you an even deeper insight into how they live a Christ-like life.